He was a bounty hunter who despised the Lakota with every fiber of his being. His mission was simple: track them, hunt them, destroy them. But when a violent storm forced him into their sacred cave, sealed since 1845, everything he believed about himself shattered in an instant. What he discovered in those ancient walls wasn't gold or artifacts. It was a truth so devastating, so earth-shattering, that it transformed a cold-blooded killer into something he never imagined possible. The man who entered that cave hunting Lakota blood would emerge as their unlikely protector, carrying a secret that would change everything. I ask that at this moment you subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us every day. Subscribe now, and go to the comments of this video and write from which city or place you are watching this video. Now let's go to the story after the intro.
Indigenous West Stories.
The year was 1920, and the American frontier still bled with the wounds of conquest. In this harsh landscape of broken treaties and endless conflict, Elijah Walker had carved out a reputation as one of the most ruthless bounty hunters west of the Mississippi. His weathered face bore the scars of countless confrontations, his cold blue eyes reflecting years of violence that had hardened his soul into something resembling steel. Elijah was not born into hatred. Like all destructive emotions, it was carefully cultivated, nurtured by a father who understood that survival in their world required choosing sides. From the moment young Elijah could hold a rifle, his father filled his mind with stories of Lakota savagery, of innocent settlers butchered in their sleep, of a people who stood against progress and civilization. The boy absorbed these lessons like parched earth drinks rain, until hatred became as natural to him as breathing. By his 20th birthday, Elijah had already participated in 3 major campaigns against various tribes. His tracking skills were legendary among military commanders and civilian contractors alike. He could read the land like scripture, following trails that others would miss entirely. But despite his reputation and numerous encounters with Lakota warriors, something strange haunted his record. He had never actually killed one of them. It was not for lack of opportunity. During the skirmish at Wounded Creek, he had a young Lakota brave in his sights for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in combat. His finger rested on the trigger, steady as stone, but something made him hesitate. The shot went wide and the warrior escaped into the brush. His commanding officer attributed it to the poor light of dawn. But Elijah knew better. Something deep inside him had stayed his hand, though he could never understand what. This pattern repeated itself through the years. Close encounters, clear shots, perfect opportunities, all ending with Lakota warriors slipping away into the wilderness while Elijah stood with his weapon, unfired. His colleagues began to whisper, some questioning his commitment to their cause. But his tracking abilities were too valuable to dismiss, and his hatred for the Lakota seemed genuine enough to satisfy most doubts. The hatred was real, burning in his chest like a coal that never cooled. When he looked at Lakota faces, he saw everything his father had taught him to despise: the rejection of civilization, the stubborn clinging to old ways, the refusal to accept the inevitable march of progress. He convinced himself that his inability to kill them was merely a tactical preference. Live enemies could lead him to their camps, their hidden strongholds, their sacred places. In the spring of 1920, opportunity knocked on Elijah's door in the form of a well-dressed man named Harrison Blackwood. Blackwood represented a consortium of railroad investors who had grown tired of delays caused by what they termed Indian interference along their proposed route through the Black Hills. The job was simple enough: track down a group of men who had been operating near the sacred sites, disrupting surveying operations and threatening workers. The pay was exceptional, enough to set Elijah up for years if he chose to retire from the hunting life. But more than money, the assignment offered something he craved: the chance to penetrate deep into Lakota territory, to strike at the heart of their spiritual world. The target area included the vicinity of an ancient cave system that had been sealed by tribal elders in 1845, following some catastrophic event that the Lakota refused to discuss with outsiders. Before departing, Elijah made his usual rounds through the frontier settlements, gathering intelligence and supplies. It was during one of these stops that he encountered Joseph Standing Bear, an elderly Lakota man who worked as a translator for the territorial government. Standing Bear was one of the few natives who moved freely between the white and Indian worlds, trusted by neither but tolerated by both for his usefulness. When Standing Bear learned of Elijah's destination, his weathered face grew grave. "That place you seek," he said in his careful English, "it is not meant for men like you. The cave has been sealed for good reason. There are no treasures there, no gold or silver, only truths that some are not prepared to face." Elijah laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet trading post. "Old man, I've heard every ghost story and superstition your people can conjure. I'm not afraid of your spirits or your curses." Standing Bear studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look through Elijah rather than at him. "It is not our spirits you should fear, Walker. It is your own truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." The warning only strengthened Elijah's resolve. He had spent his entire adult life fighting against Lakota mysticism and what he saw as their primitive worldview. The idea that some cave could hold power over him was exactly the kind of thinking he had dedicated his life to destroying. He purchased his supplies and rode out the next morning, Standing Bear's words already forgotten in his eagerness to complete the mission. The journey into the Black Hills took him through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in the territory. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. The air itself seemed different here, charged with something Elijah could not name but refused to acknowledge. This was sacred land to the Lakota, the heart of their spiritual world, but to Elijah it was simply another obstacle to overcome. For 3 days he tracked his quarry through the wilderness, following signs that grew fresher with each mile. The men he pursued were skilled, but not skilled enough to completely hide their passage from someone of Elijah's abilities. They were moving toward the sealed cave, just as Blackwood had suspected. Whatever they were planning, it involved the ancient site that the Lakota guarded so jealously. On the 4th day, the weather turned violent with the sudden fury that characterized spring storms in the mountains. The sky darkened to the color of old blood, and lightning began to split the air with increasing frequency. Elijah had faced many storms in his years on the frontier, but this one felt different, personal, almost, as if the very sky had turned against him. The wind rose to a howl that drowned out all other sounds, and rain began to fall in sheets so thick he could barely see his horse's ears. Within minutes, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees, and what had been rain began to turn to sleet. Elijah knew he needed shelter immediately or risk losing his life to exposure. Through the storm, he caught sight of a dark opening in the rocky hillside ahead. Even through the driving precipitation, he could make out the artificial nature of the entrance, stones carefully placed, symbols carved into the rock face. This was the sealed cave, the sacred site that Standing Bear had warned him away from. Under normal circumstances, Elijah might have sought shelter elsewhere, not from any respect for Lakota beliefs, but from tactical caution. But these were not normal circumstances. A sudden gust of wind knocked him from his horse, and he felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder as he struck the rocky ground. When he tried to stand, his vision blurred and he realized he was more injured than he had initially thought. The storm was intensifying, and he could already feel the dangerous cold seeping into his bones. He had perhaps minutes before hypothermia began to set in. The cave entrance loomed before him, dark and forbidding but undeniably dry. The stones that had sealed it had been partially displaced. Whether by time, weather, or human hands, he could not tell. The opening was just large enough for a man to squeeze through if he was determined enough. Elijah looked back at the storm, then at the cave, and made his choice. Pushing through the narrow opening was more difficult than he had anticipated. The displaced stones scraped against his injured shoulder, sending waves of pain through his body. But finally he tumbled through into the darkness beyond, immediately struck by the profound silence that enveloped him. The storm's fury was reduced to a distant whisper, and the temperature, while cool, was far more bearable than the killing cold outside. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Elijah began to make out the details of his surroundings. The cave was larger than he had expected, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadow above. The walls were covered with paintings and carvings, some clearly ancient, others more recent. By the light of a match, he could see that this was not simply a natural cave but a constructed sacred space, carefully shaped and decorated over generations. Moving deeper into the cave, following a passage that seemed to lead toward the heart of the hill, Elijah discovered that the sacred site was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Chamber after chamber opened before him, each filled with artifacts, paintings, and symbols that spoke of centuries of continuous use. This was not just a cave. It was a repository of Lakota history and culture, a library written in stone and hide and bone. In the deepest chamber behind what appeared to be a deliberately constructed wall that had been recently breached, Elijah made a discovery that stopped him cold. Spread across a natural shelf in the rock were dozens of documents, some written on traditional materials, others on paper that was clearly of European origin. Maps, treaties, letters, and what appeared to be official records, all carefully preserved in the dry air of the cave. With trembling hands, Elijah began to examine the documents by the light of his remaining matches. Many were written in Lakota, incomprehensible to him, but others were in English, French, and Spanish. As he read, a picture began to emerge of relationships between the Lakota and various European powers that contradicted everything he had been taught about the history of the region. But it was a single document, written in English in a hand he recognized, that shattered his world completely. The paper was a letter dated 1844, written by his own father to a woman named Ayanna, which he knew was a Lakota name meaning eternal blossom. The letter spoke of love, of promises made and kept, of a child who would need to be protected from a world that would never accept him for what he truly was. Elijah read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated his consciousness. His father, the man who had taught him to hate the Lakota with every fiber of his being, had loved a Lakota woman. More than loved her, had lived with her, had planned a life with her, had fathered a child with her. The child mentioned in the letter could only be Elijah himself. With growing desperation, he searched through the other documents, finding more evidence of the relationship between his father and the woman named Ayanna. There were records of their ceremony, conducted according to Lakota tradition. There were maps showing the location of their shared home, deep in territory that was supposed to be hostile to all white men. There were letters from Ayanna's family, accepting the white man into their clan, treating him as a son and brother. The final document was the most devastating of all. It was Ayanna's own words, written in careful English that she had learned from her lover, describing the night that soldiers came to their home. She wrote of hiding in the root cellar while her husband fought to protect their infant son, of watching through a crack in the floorboards as he was forced to choose between his child's life and his child's identity. The soldiers, she wrote, had come with orders to kill all mixed-blood children in the area, part of a campaign to prevent the emergence of individuals who might bridge the gap between white and native worlds. Elijah's father had been given a choice: watch his son die, or take the boy away and raise him as a white child, ensuring that he would never know his true heritage or seek to reconnect with his mother's people. Ayanna described her husband's anguish as he made the only choice that would save their son's life. She wrote of watching him carry the baby away into the night, knowing that she would never see either of them again. She wrote of the promise he made to teach the boy to hate the Lakota, to ensure that he would never be tempted to seek out his mother's people, and thereby risk exposure and death. The letter ended with Ayanna's own promise: to preserve the truth in this sacred place, so that someday, if the spirits willed it, her son might find his way home and learn who he truly was. She had died the following winter, according to a note added by another hand, but not before ensuring that the evidence of Elijah's true parentage would be preserved for posterity. Elijah sat in the darkness of the cave, surrounded by the artifacts of a people he had spent his life hunting, and felt his entire identity crumble around him. Every belief he had held about himself, every certainty that had guided his actions, every justification for the hatred that had driven him, all of it was built on a lie, designed to keep him alive. He was not a white man who hunted Indians. He was a Lakota who had been taught to hunt his own people. The blood he had sought to spill was his own blood. The culture he had tried to destroy was his own culture. The sacred places he had violated were his own sacred places. The realization brought with it a physical pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if something vital inside him had torn apart, leaving him hollow and gasping. He understood now why he had never been able to kill a Lakota warrior, why something had always stayed his hand at the crucial moment. Some part of him, buried deep beneath years of conditioning and lies, had recognized his own people and refused to harm them. When the storm finally passed and Elijah emerged from the cave, he was no longer the same man who had entered it. The physical world looked the same trees, the same rocks, the same sky. But everything had changed, because he had changed. The hatred that had burned in his chest for so many years was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to echo with the voices of all the people he had helped to hunt and persecute. He returned to the settlements, but not to report on his mission. Instead, he quietly gathered what few possessions mattered to him and disappeared into the wilderness. For weeks, he wandered the borderlands between White and Lakota territory, trying to process what he had learned and decide what to do with the knowledge. The first time he approached a Lakota camp, he was met with suspicion and hostility that was entirely justified. His reputation preceded him, and there were warriors in the camp who had faced him in battle. They knew him as an enemy, and the fact that he came now with empty hands and peaceful words meant nothing to them. "You are Walker," said one of the warriors, a man named Crow Feather whom Elijah recognized from a skirmish 2 years earlier. "You are the one who tracks our people for the soldiers. Why do you come here now?" Elijah had prepared no speech, had rehearsed no explanation. He simply told the truth. "I come because I have learned that I am not who I thought I was. I come because the blood in my veins is the same blood that flows in yours." The claim was met with laughter and scorn. Mixed-blood children were not unknown among the Lakota, but they were raised within the tribe, taught their heritage from birth. The idea that a man like Walker could be one of their own seemed absurd, but there was something in Elijah's manner, some fundamental change in the way he carried himself, that prevented them from simply driving him away or killing him outright. "Prove it," Crow Feather demanded. "If you are truly one of us, prove it." Elijah had brought with him some of the documents from the cave, including the letter from his father and the record of his parents' ceremony. He presented these to the tribal elders, along with his story of discovery. The elders examined the documents carefully, consulting among themselves in rapid Lakota that Elijah could not understand. Finally, an elderly woman named Grandmother Willow spoke. She had been present at the ceremony described in the documents, had known Ayanna personally. She studied Elijah's face for a long time, looking for traces of the woman she had known decades earlier. "Ayanna had eyes like winter sky," she said finally, "and a small scar here, on her chin, from a fall when she was a child." She reached out and touched Elijah's chin, where a similar scar marked his own face. "You have her eyes. You have her scar. You have her stubborn spirit, I think." The recognition was not immediate acceptance. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, and Elijah had done much to earn the enmity of the Lakota people. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of hostility that had separated him from his true heritage. Over the following months, Elijah began to learn what he had lost when his father carried him away from his mother's people. He learned the language that should have been his first language, the stories that should have shaped his childhood, the spiritual practices that should have guided his development into manhood. It was like trying to rebuild a house that had been torn down to its foundation, but he persevered with the same determination that had once made him such an effective hunter. The learning was not easy, and it was not always welcome. Many in the tribe remained suspicious of his motives, convinced that his apparent conversion was some elaborate trick designed to gather intelligence for future attacks. Others, while accepting his sincerity, questioned whether a man who had lived so long as their enemy could ever truly become one of them. But Elijah persisted, driven by a need to understand not just who he was, but who he might have been if circumstances had been different. He learned to see the world through Lakota eyes, to understand the spiritual connections that bound the people to the land, to appreciate the wisdom embedded in traditions that he had once dismissed as primitive superstition. The transformation was not merely intellectual. As he spent more time among his mother's people, Elijah began to feel a sense of belonging that he had never experienced in the white world. Despite his father's love and care, he had always felt like an outsider in white society. never quite fitting in despite his apparent success. Among the Lakota, even as a newcomer struggling to learn their ways, he felt a connection that went deeper than shared blood. It was during this period of learning and growth that the attacks began. White settlers and military forces, emboldened by new policies from Washington, launched a series of raids against Lakota camps. These were not the formal military campaigns of previous years, but brutal surprise attacks designed to terrorize and scatter the remaining free tribes. Elijah found himself in an impossible position. His former colleagues and employers were now attacking the people he was trying to reconnect with, using tactics and strategies that he himself had helped to develop. When the first attack came, striking a small camp where families had gathered for a seasonal ceremony, Elijah watched in horror as soldiers cut down men, women, and children without discrimination. The massacre lasted only minutes, but its impact on Elijah was profound. These were not the faceless enemies of his father's stories, but real people with names and families and dreams. He had lived among them, shared their food, listened to their stories. The woman who fell with a bullet in her back had taught him to weave grass into rope. The old man who died protecting his grandchildren had shared stories of Elijah's mother, had helped him understand the woman he had never known. That night, as the survivors mourned their dead and tended their wounded, Elijah made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could not undo the years he had spent as an enemy of his own people, but he could ensure that his knowledge and skills were used to protect them rather than destroy them. He began to operate in the shadows, using his understanding of white military tactics to anticipate and counter attacks before they could be launched. His knowledge of the terrain and his contacts in the white settlements allowed him to gather intelligence about planned raids, giving the Lakota time to evacuate or prepare defenses. At first, his warnings were met with suspicion. How could they trust information from someone who had so recently been their enemy? But when his intelligence proved accurate time and again, saving lives and preventing disasters, the tribal leaders began to rely on his reports. Elijah's transformation from hunter to protector was not without cost. He was now a wanted man in white settlements, branded as a traitor and renegade. Former friends and colleagues put prices on his head, and he was forced to live constantly on the move, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked down. But the real cost was emotional. Every attack he prevented, every life he saved, served as a reminder of the attacks he had enabled, the lives he had helped to destroy. The guilt was a constant companion, a weight that grew heavier rather than lighter as time passed. He began to understand that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, one that might never truly end. It was during one of his intelligence-gathering missions that Elijah first encountered Ayanna's niece, a young woman named Winona, who had inherited her aunt's intelligence and strength. Winona was working as a translator for the territorial government, much as Joseph Standing Bear had done. But she was also secretly passing information to the tribal leaders about government plans and policies. Their first meeting was tense and awkward. Winona knew who Elijah was, knew his history, and his recent conversion. She was suspicious of his motives and skeptical of his claims to Lakota heritage. But she was also pragmatic enough to recognize the value of his intelligence and his unique position between the two worlds. Over time, as they worked together to protect their people, a mutual respect developed between them. Winona came to see that Elijah's commitment to the Lakota cause was genuine, born not of guilt or political calculation, but of a deep need to reconnect with his true identity. Elijah, for his part, was amazed by Winona's courage and intelligence, her ability to navigate the dangerous waters between white and native societies while maintaining her integrity and her loyalty to her people. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on shared danger and common purpose rather than romantic attraction. They were both people who had been forced to live between worlds, never fully belonging to either, and they found in each other an understanding that neither had experienced before. The turning point in their relationship came during a particularly dangerous mission. Elijah had learned of a planned attack on a large gathering of Lakota families, a winter ceremony that would bring together several bands in a remote valley. The attack was scheduled for dawn, when the people would be sleeping and vulnerable. Elijah and Winona raced through the night to reach the gathering before the soldiers, but they arrived to find that they were too late to evacuate everyone safely. Instead, they had to help organize a defense using Elijah's knowledge of military tactics to turn the ceremonial ground into a fortress. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Elijah's previous experience. Instead of hunting his own people, he was fighting alongside them, using his skills to protect rather than destroy. When a soldier's bullet grazed his temple, Winona was there to bind the wound. When her position was overrun, he was there to cover her retreat. They fought side by side through the long morning, and when the soldiers finally withdrew, they had saved most of the families in the gathering. But the cost had been high, and both Elijah and Winona bore new scars from the battle. That night, as they sat by a small fire tending their wounds, Winona spoke the words that changed everything between them. "You are no longer the man who hunted us," she said quietly. "You are the man who protects us. You are home." It was not a declaration of love in the romantic sense, but something deeper, an acceptance, a recognition of belonging that Elijah had been seeking all his life. When they married the following spring, it was not just the union of two individuals, but the completion of Elijah's long journey back to his true identity. The years that followed were not peaceful, but they were purposeful. Elijah continued to work in the shadows, protecting his people from the ongoing encroachment of white settlement and military action. He and Winona had children, and he was able to give them what had been taken from him: knowledge of their heritage, connection to their people, pride in their identity. As he grew older, Elijah became something of a legend among the Lakota, though his story was told quietly, shared only among trusted friends and family. He was the man who had been lost and found his way home, who had turned from destroyer to protector, who had proved that it was possible to overcome even the deepest conditioning and find one's true path. Standing Bear, the old translator who had warned him away from the sacred cave, lived long enough to see Elijah's transformation. In their final conversation, the elderly man smiled and said, "I told you that cave held truths some are not prepared to face, but you were prepared, even if you did not know it. Your mother's spirit guided you home." When Elijah finally died, many years later, he was buried according to Lakota tradition in the hills near the sacred cave where his journey of discovery had begun. His children and grandchildren gathered to honor a man who had spent the first half of his life as an enemy of his own people, and the second half as their protector and guardian. The story of Elijah Walker became part of Lakota oral tradition, passed down through generations as a reminder that identity is not always what it appears to be, that hatred can be overcome by truth, and that it is never too late to find one's way home. In a world divided by race and culture, his life stood as proof that the human heart is capable of transformation, that love can triumph over conditioning, and that the truth, no matter how painful, can set us free. The sacred cave where it all began was eventually sealed again, but not before Elijah had the chance to add his own contribution to the repository of family history. He left behind a letter for future generations, telling his story and expressing his gratitude for the chance to discover who he truly was. The letter ended with words that captured the essence of his remarkable journey. "I spent my life hunting Lakota, only to discover that I was hunting myself. In finding my people, I found my soul."